That's Laura.
That's Daniel.
That's me. This is Behind the Message, the podcast. Hey, Laura. This is our fourth one. We made it a whole month.
A whole month. And Daniel just looked at me and said, it's time to start. I have no idea what we're about to say.
It's going to be great. You do. All right, so we're still going through Ephesians 4.
We are, yes.
You're
that
Ephesians
I know.
4. And we're going to look at verse 11, and we're going to go all the way through verse 14 again and break down really the last two verses. Last week, we focused on the first two. So
Yep.
I'll read it for us, and then you can figure out what we're doing if you're so. You're going to be good. All right, here we go. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we all attain to the unity of the faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be children, tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. All right, so I got some slack like a month or two ago because I gave the illustration of the kids at the beach. You remember this?
Yes.
Like little kids.
And
so
they go
that's right.
in the waves.
That's right, because they're little and they don't know anything. It's just like water. It's
But
like a bathtub. Then they do the little toddler run.
That's not
If
why
you're
you
listening,
got
you can't
slack.
see, but I'm trying to do like the toddler run. But they do the little toddler run. They get down into the water and then a wave just smacks them.
So why did you get slack for telling that illustration? It's not because of the kids that get like tumbled in the waves. Do you remember why?
No.
It's because at the end of the illustration, you look out at the church and you say, now, don't get mad at me. I watched them for fun.
Well, it is fun. It's so, but you learn so much about the little kid and whether or not they actually get back up, right? Okay, so here's what's happening in the context of chapter 4. We're called to this maturity to grow. And we're tempted to just be satisfied. And usually because we're selfish, we want to be satisfied with wherever we're at. So in other words, wherever we are now is like satisfactory. And anything beyond that is extra. Yeah. You know, that's like for the people who go to seminary or for pastors or somebody else. But this is just good enough. And so we, in that, lose that the call is the full stature of Christ's likeness. So we are called to grow up into Him, into every aspect of Him, into Christ's likeness. That's our longing to be what we have been declared to be. And so as we grow and as we mature in Him, Paul not only talks about the full stature of Christ and sets the goal, but he also speaks to the consequences if we don't. And if we don't, we remain weak children, like little bitty types that run into the ocean and just get rocked by life. And so we kind of have two things here to talk about. The first is the call to the full stature of Christ. And then we also have the consequences of being carried about, being tossed to and fro when we don't grow. And so let me kick it to you. We'll talk about the first one. What is it about this call to continually grow and mature that sits in front of us and is both, it's something you're not going to arrive at. Right. Like you're not going to be perfect. And yet you shouldn't be satisfied to just stay where you're at. So what is it about when you read this work of ministry to build up the body to the full stature of Christ? What is it about that for you is both challenging? What is it about for you that's maybe comforting? What is it about that seems daunting? I don't know, but just kind of personalize it a little bit.
You asked a lot of questions all at once. That's a thing that Paul does.
Really? The apostle or the pastor?
No, the pastor.
Okay.
He'll ask 6 questions and be like, so, daunting? I mean, what does it say? The measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Like, that's daunting. I think the idea of never arriving at the thing, for me, I think for some people and some people that I talk to, that almost becomes an excuse. Like, oh, well, I know that I'll never get to this thing, so why, not like, why should I try? That's not usually what they say, but that's
No,
kind of...
They know they can't say it that way, but that's kind
right,
of the
but
excuse.
that's kind of baked into like
right.
what they're actually saying is just this underlying, like, it's not even worth trying, or it's worth trying a little bit, but maybe not giving your life to, like we talked about a couple weeks ago, like your vocation to. So I think for me, like, that's daunting, to just recognize where I am and how far that is away from the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. What else did you ask?
So let's go back to that for just a second, because I think owning the gap is important. And when I say the gap, let's imagine we're in Kingsport, or we're not in Kingsport, we're in Gray. I live in Kingsport. So we're in Gray, and the goal is to get to Alaska.
Yeah.
Got to make it to Alaska. If you give the same parallel to your conversion, Gray, Christ-likeness, Alaska, like, how far have you made it? What measure of sanctification do you think you've experienced? Do you look and go, man, I am in Canada, well on my way? Do you think I have I've made it down the interstate? I'm like to Knoxville.
So I was thinking, like, I a little bit. Like, I wanted to say Kingsport, but then I'm like, is Kingsport on the way to Alaska? I don't even know.
So you can't answer the question because you don't know geographically which way you should go.
I mean, I know, like, generally west, but that's all I got.
I love that illustration. I think it was R.C. Sproul who kind of broke that down pretty famously. And his point was, and you've made it like a step.
Yeah.
The distance between where you're presently at and Christ-likeness is massive, massive. And so if you're using the Alaska illustration, the truth is you've probably made it to like your driveway. The full stature of Christ. I mean, you're talking about perfection. We're talking about the holiness of God. And he is doing that work in us. So yes, it is daunting. And yes, if left to ourselves, we would never make it. Yeah. But he is doing a work in us that is literally making us into what we've been declared to be. And so as the church, the goal isn't so much that you are going to, by your works, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get this thing done. You're not going to make it that way. Yeah. That's not how this happens. But there is a longing, there is an eagerness, a desire to walk accordingly, to not resist the work of the Spirit that would lead us in this way, but instead to welcome it, to walk with humility, yielding to it, right? To walk enduring the hardships in love with one another to that end. And so here when he says to mature manhood to the measure, the full stature of Christ, man, that is a daunting goal, but it is such a good goal. Yeah. And it shouldn't overwhelm us because it's not by our power, it's by the power of the Spirit. Right. But it should compel us not to resist it, not to resist that work of the Spirit, but to long for it, to pray for it, to seek it, because our life is in Jesus. And we long to experience the fullness of that. And so that expression is, I think it's a pretty good way to kind of get your mind around it. Yeah. But then he goes further and he says in verse 14, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. So practically speaking, when you read that and you think about being tossed to and fro and carried away, what's that look like in everyday life? Because I don't know that somebody sits there and go, Joe over there was carried away by, we don't say that. It's not like, man, the wind came of sound or of bad doctrine and just he flew away like a kite. Yeah. So we don't quite speak in that terminology. So, like, practically, what does that look like in our life?
I think, so practical example from my own life, I think you see this a lot on social media. And I personally am not on a lot of social media, and this is why, is because I think there's so much that's just slippery about the things that people will say, and like it's not often so blatant that you get just thrown like a kite, to use your
right
example. What?
So I was just thinking, so I was pointing to the text. So hence the deceitful. The word I like in that is like it says crafty. Yeah. It's like sneaky. You know, I mean, it's not like it's coming in and it's like, hey, I am here to lead you astray.
Right. It's like when we were in Peter a couple years ago as a church, and I remember this so well because it was almost like a new thought for me, and so has stuck with me. In 2 Peter, it talks about the false teachers who secretly bring in destructive heresies. Like, they're not walking in with trumpets and flags being like, I am here to destroy your faith.
Right.
It's so much subtler than that.
That's right.
It's quiet, and it's I like the word slippery because it feels just hard to grasp almost.
Yeah.
And so you hear a thing.
There's measures of kind of partial truth.
Yeah, and you hear it, and so it sounds good, or it sounds okay at least. Or maybe you want to give, so I use the social media example, like it's someone you follow, it's a friend, it's someone you like, and so maybe you want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And you say, oh, well, I'm sure that's not what they meant by that. And you kind of justify it in your mind. And the more I think that I justify things like that in my mind, I'm thinking then on, meditating on, pondering things that aren't actually true. They're a measure of partial truth, and I don't think we realize just how dangerous that is.
That's right.
And how much left to myself, I won't take the partial truth that I'm considering and turn it into truth on my own. Like it just keeps going, and in the every wind of doctrine, in the human cunning, in the deceitful schemes, it goes to and fro.
That's right.
And back and forth, and we lose. 2 Peter ends with that we would lose our stability. One of the things I like about this illustration, to be children, like you said, you learn a lot about the kids. So I was at the beach last summer with some of my cousins that are younger, and there's one of them that all he does is he runs just straight into the wave, like full body, just stands there, waits for it to hit him. Does he get tossed around? Yes. And what does he do? He gets back up and he runs straight back into the wave. And he's, 8, so that's fun for him, and it does not hurt him or make him sore at the end of the day. I, however, am a grown-up, and I'm old, and so when I fall down, it hurts me.
It hurts.
It hurts, and so I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to be a child, and so translate that into spiritual terms, like as spiritual children, this happens, and you have, ideally, as a spiritual child, as a new believer in the faith, you have people around you who are really holding your hand. Like, they're your parent who's going to come and just pick you up out of the surf. But once, as an adult, like, it is so dangerous to stay as a spiritual child and to continue to get tossed.
When you say hurt, I think that's the disconnect. We don't realize in the subtle worldview how much the reinforcement of those crafty, like deceitful lies hurt us. Mm-hmm. So we don't see the connection between reinforcing again and again. You just have to follow your heart. Mm-hmm. Or the statement like happy wife, happy life. Mm-hmm. We don't see the connection between those building false worldviews and the sense of brokenness that builds up, that contributes to the divorce 5 years, 10 years down the road. Because we don't put enough thought into it. And who wants to really just correct that person who's just flippantly saying something with very little thought?
Well, and that's so prevalent. Everything in our world and culture says those things.
That's right.
And so if you're going to be the one to speak up against it, you're kind of on your own.
That's right. And you sound like the guy who's just being like uptight
Yeah.
and overly serious. And the reason that you sound that way, just believe or hear me, think about this. The reason that you sound that way is because the culture does not assess danger to those deceitful schemes. Mm-hmm. They're slippery, as you would say. They don't see it as that bad. And then by the time those lies mount up into a worldview that leads to you being tossed to and fro, or a friend being carried away, or whatever that would be, by then it's like it's disconnected. Oh. And so we never want to deal with those things. And here what we're seeing Paul say is we are to grow up into every way, speaking the truth in love to Christ-likeness. Mm-hmm. It should saturate our entire life. And when we give even the smallest, slippery, deceitful scheme an inch in our life, it's going to take a mile. Yeah. And I don't think I think the problem is, as we approach this text, we disconnect it from the danger. And think about it. And Paul pointed this out on Sunday. The Apostle Paul could have just gone through and taught this entire text and avoided the consequences. I mean, he could have just kept going from verse 13 to the full stature of Christ and then pick up right in verse 15 and go speak the truth in love and keep going. It was important enough to pause and acknowledge when we don't do these things,
this is what happens. And
we are going to be hurt.
Yeah.
And the body of Christ will be hurt. And so I think one of the challenges for us as we talk about praying Scripture is that we would pray to not be satisfied with where we're at, but we would pray longing for God's will to be done in our life, for Him to sanctify and grow us more and more into the image of His Son Jesus, exposing and tearing down anything in our life that would entangle us and hold us back, so that we might be able to stand strong and help others stand strong against the schemes of the devil and against the sin of the flesh that would hurt us. And so I think that's the challenge, and I think that's a good one this week, and to pray those things, I think that'll help us a lot.
Yeah, that's good. So just a reminder for you, the goal of this and of us as a church as we're going through Ephesians 4, talk about these things. So sit down like Daniel did with me today and just say, hey, let's talk about it.
Let's talk.
Let's talk.
So you didn't know what was going to happen. It turned out great.
I did not, because we're just talking. And you're like, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to figure out what you think about this. So do that with the people who are in your life. And if you have questions, you can send them to us at BTM@tcbchurch.org, and maybe we'll talk about them.
So the thing is, the questions we're going to build. We got I think maybe one more week or so, and then we're going to jump into, we've been compiling some questions. We've got some, but we're going to get into some questions. Ask anything. And again, good questions, we'll answer those. And if you ask bad questions, we'll even answer those too. It'll be fun. Bye.